Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you with us for our April edition of our Brown Bag in Science series. This is Lynette Kraft. I'm the Chief Science Officer here at ACSM. Today, we're really happy to have Diane DellaValle with us. Diane is an Associate Professor and Research Nutritionist and Dietitian at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania. She's also been a very active member of ACSM, serving on the Evidence-Based Practice Committee and assisting us with our Evidence Analyst program. She's also very involved with the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and their Evidence Analyst Library. Diane received her bachelor's degree in Nutrition and Dietetics through their coordinated program at Marywood University, so she's back at her alma mater. Her master's degree is in Nutritional Sciences from Penn State University, and her PhD is in Human Nutrition from Cornell University. Today, Diane is going to talk with us about her funded line of research that focuses on iron status, how iron status affects performance, and how iron uptake can be increased in female athletes. So at this point, we'll turn it over to Diane. Welcome, Diane.
All right, thanks so much, Lynette and Becky, for organizing and for having me. So really, I'm going to talk about improving iron status in the female athlete, but we could switch female athlete to active females. We're not talking about elite athletes here exclusively by any means. So what do I study? Primarily, I study iron depletion without anemia in a number of populations. And from there, I look at how iron status affects performance. So looking at human performance, so physical performance, both in and outside of the laboratory, and also cognitive performance in and outside of the laboratory. And the ultimate goal of my research program is to improve iron status for populations around the world. So primarily looking at female endurance athletes or active females, the consequences of iron depletion without anemia are really important to training and performance. So those of you who are either recreational athletes or have been elite athletes who have trained for some kind of goal, be it a 5K, a 10K, a marathon, you likely know that iron affects your performance. So in studies that we've conducted, we found that rowers in particular who were iron deficient but not anemic had slower 2K personal best times that were 21 seconds slower than the rowers who were who had normal iron status, and that they trained 10 minutes less per day. So if you take that 10 minutes less per day and take it over a week, that's over an hour more per week that girls with normal iron status train compared to those with poor iron status. The girls with poor iron status also reached a lower VO2 peak and had higher blood lactate concentrations during a time trial. So what this means is that they had to work harder to do the same amount of work that the girls with normal iron status did. So this is an example of one of our time trials here. So here's a rower on a rowing machine. Many of you may be familiar with rowing machines in a gym. This is how we hook them up inside of a lab. So we essentially have everybody breathing room air, and then we collect everything that they exhale into a machine that analyzes how much O2 and CO2 they exhale to look at their energy expenditure. And we can see how much more work they do in the form of calories, carbohydrate and fat calories primarily, during a time trial. So some other methods that we use is the randomized controlled trial, or the double-blind randomized controlled supplementation trial, to see how does iron supplementation, does that affect these girls during training. So whether it's rowers, runners, swimmers, or just recreationally active females. So what we have to do in these types of studies is get a measure of your iron status. So not only your hemoglobin, which is a measure of if you're anemic or not, but we need to measure your iron stores, which is your ferritin. So before we treat anybody, we need a measure of your iron status, so your hemoglobin and your ferritin at the absolute least. And then we also look at body composition, weight, and those types of things. And then people are randomized to receive either iron or placebo, or in the latest trial that I've just conducted, everybody received iron, and we looked at how to improve that iron uptake by randomizing folks to receive either a pre and probiotic supplement called a synbiotic or a placebo. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then these trials can last from 6 to 8 weeks. So with a very low dose of iron, we can replete somebody's iron status up to normal if everything else is normal. So if they're not bleeding, if they're not a serial blood donor, and all that kind of thing. So a low dose of iron supplementation would be about the amount that's in a 1-a-day multivitamin. So for women, that's about 18 milligrams of elemental iron a day. So over 6 to 8 weeks, we can replete that. But for the purposes of a researcher, we still need to get a midpoint measurement of your iron status. So at 3 to 4 weeks. And then again, at the end of the trial, we need to see, did you really become repleted? So at 8 or 4 or 6 or 8 weeks, at the end of the trial, we measure your iron status again. And then of course we measure compliance with supplementation. We look at training. So whether you're a recreationally active female or an athlete, we need to know what you've done to see if that would have affected your iron status or uptake of whatever supplement we give throughout the trial, using daily logs. And of course, any GI effects of whatever supplement that we give. So we find that with low dose iron supplementation, we don't get many GI symptoms reported. And also we find much better compliance with these low dose supplements. So here's a little bit of data. So looking at girls who have low serum ferritin stores. So low would be less than 20 micrograms per liter of ferritin. So again, your ferritin is a measure of your iron storage. So basically we need a little bit of stores in our liver to be released when our iron becomes low. So it can make hemoglobin for us and be able to help us do the work we need to do, compared to girls whose iron storage protein was normal. So you can see here that those who were supplemented with iron, they had an improvement in their energetic efficiency over those who received a placebo. But that only works if you're iron deficient. So it's not a great idea to just say, let's blanket supplement everybody who is active so they have the iron that they need. Because if you're not iron deficient, you won't respond to an iron supplement. Our body has a really great mechanism to tightly conserve iron for when we need it, because our body can't get rid of iron like it gets rid of other nutrients. We don't pee or poop it out like we do with other nutrients when we have excess. So one dangerous thing is that we don't want iron building up in our soft tissues. Iron's a heavy metal. So we don't want iron accumulating in our eyes and our brain and our liver if we don't need it. So our body really has a nice shut-off valve to shut off absorption when we don't need it and turn on absorption when we need it most. So that's why you can see the girls with the lowest iron status absorb the most and benefited the most from supplementation in terms of their energy expenditure. So what this tells us is that when we need iron, we'll absorb more, but also those who need iron take it up the quickest, and also we need iron to help us do work. So those who are iron depleted, they spend more calories to do the same amount of work than those compared to those who don't need it. We also look at training quality. So we came up with a way to measure training quality in a validated training log. And girls who were supplemented with iron, who were iron depleted, had higher training quality scores when they were supplemented with iron, almost 3-fold. So training quality in this study was measured. We basically combined scores of training intensity, motivation, concentration. So not only physical characteristics, but cognitive characteristics of training. And over again, we see these same things. So female athletes are at risk, and recreationally active females are at risk of iron depletion without anemia. And poor dietary iron absorption is a major cause. So they have diets that are low in iron to begin with. They also have diets that may be high in inhibitors of iron absorption, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also diets that are low in enhancers of iron absorption. So female athletes in particular, they have poor intake. So a lot of female athletes don't meet the calorie requirements. First of all, they have very low calorie intakes. So there's no way they're going to meet their iron intake of 18 milligrams if they're not taking in 1,200 calories. Plus they have increased requirements due to training. So if you have a really high training load, you're going to have increased requirements of iron due to that training load. So it really is individualized due to that level of training, especially in endurance athletes. They also may have poor absorption and or release from their stores, and this is due to inflammation. So back to the training load, a higher load, depending on what surface you run in, if you have bleeding issues, and combined with your poor intake, all of that leads to what is an individual's iron requirement. So I can't tell you that runners have this requirement, rowers have this requirement. It's very individual, and it has to do a lot with your training load, your diet, and all that other stuff. So all of this is very individualized. Now, absorption of iron from the diet, speaking in the most general terms, iron sources come from two dietary components. So we have animal sources, which is called heme iron, and plant sources, which is called non-heme iron. So animal sources or heme iron, we absorb much better. So the absorption rate of animal or heme iron is about 25%. So 25% of the iron in a piece of meat is absorbable to us. So we're able to take in and use 25% of the iron from a piece of meat. Now, comparatively, plant sources or non-heme iron, we're only able to absorb and take in and use anywhere from 5 to 15% of that iron. And the range is very large because it really depends what that iron is tied to or bound with. And the absorption of both of these sources is significantly influenced by our body iron status. So this could increase or decrease anywhere from 10 to 40%. So just like I said, if somebody's iron status is really low, they're going to absorb much more from a supplement and the diet compared to somebody whose iron status is really good. Now, a huge factor is our meal matrix, or what we're eating everything with. We don't just eat a piece of steak by itself, or we don't eat a cup of beans by itself. So things in our mixed meals like polyphenols and other inhibitors of iron absorption, you know, the colorful things that we need to be eating, like the tannins in tea and coffee and all of the colors in our fruits and vegetables, and I'm talking nature's colors, not Fruit Loop colors, all those things are inhibitors of iron status in a way. Now, vitamin C and other enhancers of iron absorption, that helps us to absorb more iron from plant foods. But we can't really increase the absorption of iron from animal or heme iron sources because that's already as good as it can get. So the bottom line is, if your iron status is low, you're going to absorb more from all sources. If your iron status is good, you're going to absorb what you're going to absorb because our body doesn't want to absorb too much. So here's what our requirements are. For men, the requirements, or the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, is 8 milligrams of iron per day. And for women, it's 18 milligrams of iron per day. So that difference is really because women are blood losers. We lose blood every month through a monthly menstrual cycle. Men do not lose blood. So unless a man is a serial blood donor or has some kind of bleeding issue, so GI bleed, bleeding ulcer, some kind of other issue, men don't lose blood like women. So that accounts for that difference. Now this 22 milligrams per day that I have starred, that is a requirement for military personnel due to a training load. So this is a number that we use for very highly training athletes and, again, soldiers in training due to heavy load, packing, marching, breaking down of red blood cells, and that kind of thing. Now, the tolerable upper limit, the TUL for iron, we don't like people to take in any more than 45 milligrams of iron per day. And this is because, again, we don't get rid of iron. We can't get rid of it. So we don't want iron to build up in our soft tissues. So what are good sources of iron? The best sources of iron, so people who are omnivores, people who eat meat and plants, they're in a good situation because meat and shellfish, so a 3-ounce serving of clams is anywhere from 12 to 24 milligrams of iron. Turkey, beef, those types of things are 2 to 3 milligrams in a 3-ounce serving, but it's very bioavailable. I always tell my students that if there's a question on a test for a micronutrient and liver is one of the choices and they're asking for the best source, liver is probably the answer. Liver stores all of our nutrients and liver is a great source of iron. Many people don't eat liver, so we need to give people other options. So beans, a half a cup of cooked beans. So whether it's soybeans, lentils, kidney, garbanzo beans, those are good sources of iron, but it tends not to be really bioavailable because the iron gets bound up in those colorful pigments, so the polyphenols. So generally, the less colorful the bean, such as a white bean, a chickpea, cannellini bean, that iron from those beans is a little more bioavailable than a kidney bean or a black bean. Not that they're not great foods to eat, because we need to eat a whole variety of foods, colorful fruits and vegetables. But the less colorful the food, the more bioavailable the iron is. Now, also in the United States, which is not true of all countries in the world, we have mandatory iron enrichment of our wheat supply. So 20 milligrams of iron is added per pound of flour here in the United States. So like our breads that are sold in the grocery store, cakes, cookies, those types of things are enriched with iron. So that boosts the iron up to these foods to equal about the amount of iron in beef. But again, it's not a hugely bioavailable source of iron. But you can be assured that your kids are getting iron in some way. And this is due to keep our levels of anemia in the US as low as possible. Another source of iron would be cast iron cookware. And we encourage the use of cast iron cookware in countries where the bioavailability of their iron sources or absorption of iron from plant foods is, that's basically their food. So staple food crop would be polished rice. So cook your rice in a cast iron pot. You're going to absorb some iron from that. How much? You ask, you're probably going to ask. I can't tell you how much, because it depends on how the food is seasoned. So the more acid that's cooked in the food, the more iron you're going to scrape up from that pot. It depends how seasoned your pot is, so how well worn your pot is, what's cooked in the pot, etc. So as I mentioned, you can enhance the absorption of non-heme or plant foods with vitamin C. So sources of vitamin C would be like tomatoes, not just orange juice or citrus foods, but tomatoes. Also, potatoes are a great source of vitamin C. And also pairing your non-heme or plant sources of iron with a source of heme iron. That boosts the iron absorption from a non-heme iron source. And just to remind you again that heme iron or meat sources of iron, you can't enhance it any further with vitamin C, but also it doesn't get bound up with those inhibitors that I talked about. So like if you drink a cup of coffee with your steak, it's not going to bind, the tannins in the coffee aren't going to bind up the iron from that steak. So you guys are getting a first peek at my new results from a study that I just finished here at Marywood with some Division III athletes. So Division III athletes, depending on the sport here at Marywood, are pretty close to recreationally active females, I would say. So these were basketball players, field hockey players, lacrosse players, a whole range of different athletes that were in training. So at the beginning of a training season, we screened their iron status, again, for hemoglobin and ferritin, and everybody was supplemented with a low dose of iron, about 20 milligrams per day. And then they were randomized to receive either a symbiotic supplement. So a symbiotic supplement is a combo of a prebiotic and a probiotic. So prebiotics are fermentable carbohydrates. So things like inulin, they would be found in chicory root, but this is one supplement that combines that fermentable carbohydrate plus a live active culture that you might find in kefir or yogurt or kimchi or sauerkraut. So this is one supplement. And then the other group was randomized to receive a placebo. So we got some really amazing results here. So at baseline, their iron status wasn't different. Everybody was iron deficient without anemia. And by 4 weeks, the group that was randomized to receive that symbiotic plus the iron had about a 41% increase in their iron status, and they were almost repleted compared to the placebo group. By 8 weeks, their iron status had doubled compared to the placebo group. So these are some really amazing preliminary findings that I'll be presenting at ASM, the nutrition meeting in June. So that's really exciting. So why is all this important? This is important to each one of you, regardless if you're a female athlete or not, especially if you're female, and especially if you do any type of work. because for physical performance, iron affects all of our body's energy metabolism. So regardless if you're physically active or not in an exercise capacity, those of you who have ever taken biochemistry or a metabolism course, you've probably heard the word cytochrome. Iron is involved in all of those reactions of cytochromes in what we call the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which basically turns all of our chemical or food energy into mechanical energy. And also for cognitive performance, it helps to synthesize and metabolize our neurotransmitters or our feel-good hormones in our brain. It forms the myelin of our nerves and helps in our brain energy metabolism. So, you know, all of our physical activities equal work. So whether it's, again, running, walking, doing activities of daily living, you're gardening, physical work, meaning you're making money. So whether you are doing a labor job in the US, you get paid for doing that. If you can't perform your job, you don't get paid. People in other countries get paid by the piece. So like tea pluckers in India and Sri Lanka, they get paid by how much tea they pick. So other studies have shown that if you improve their iron status, they can improve how much tea they pick and they make more money. And last but not least, our cognitive performance. So again, we're not only talking about older people here, but younger people. So little kids, cognitive performance is really important. Not that they're taking tests, but how they interact with their parents, how they interact with their peers, but also students in school and their achievement, not only on tests, but how they interact with others. And that affects how they do not only in school, but in the workplace in the future. And also how we all do in the workplace. That affects how we do on our reviews and how much money we make. So why should we all care about this? You know, what does this mean to me? Anemia itself affects 1/4 of the world's population, and half of that anemia is due to iron deficiency. So most of this affects young children, so male and female children, but also primarily pregnant and non-pregnant females of childbearing age. So I don't know how many of you out there listening right now are females, but those of you who are females and have children, this is directly relatable to you. And what can we do about it? So what do we do to improve iron status? So first and foremost, we need to eat a variety of foods. So again, we don't stop eating colorful fruits and vegetables, but we need to make sure our diet is balanced. And again, I have a picture of my plate here, but making sure that each of our plates for all of our meals is balanced with fruits and vegetables, different sources of protein, grains, most of them whole, and then a source of dairy. And we need to make sure to increase the absorbable iron in our diet by doing those things I suggested. So including a source of vitamin C at every meal. If you're a meat eater, pairing meat with your plant iron to boost the absorption. And maybe decreasing inhibitors of iron absorption that are eaten at the same meal as the bulk of your plant iron. And then we're still have that question now of pre and probiotic food choices. So this is some future research that I have to do. Does it have to be a symbiotic supplement, or can we use foods to do that, to increase the uptake of iron, not only from supplements, but from our foods as well? But primarily, it is really important to know and monitor your iron status prior to any type of supplementation. Blanket supplementation is not a great idea. I know some coaches do it, especially for their endurance female athletes at the D1 and D2 level. But again, if you are not iron deficient, you won't respond to a supplement. So it's not a great idea to be doing that. So I'd like to thank you so much and offer time for any questions you might have.
Am I muted? You're unmuted. Okay, thanks so much, Diane. That was really great and informative. We have lots of questions. We're going to start with one here from the ACSM National Office, and then we will move into some questions that have come in from our remote viewers.
Oh, hello, Diane. This is David Brewer. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about the iron fortification in the wheat. Do you know how long that's been done in this country, when that started? I was just curious.
I actually don't have a date on that, but it's been at least 30 years. Okay, okay. I was just curious. I know back, I'm in my 50s, but back when I was a kid, there was I can remember seeing a lot of things about
they would advertise things, and you were talking about cakes as being fortified with iron and, you know, essential nutrients. So I just kind of wondered, that made me think of that with the timetable. So, okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so this question is from Kelly, and it says, for the military RDA, what is the minimum requirements for that 22 milligram per day? And then they said, example, firefighters are tactical athletes as well, but very different than military. Would firefighters still need that 22 milligram per day too, on average?
That is a great question. I would definitely put firefighters and other types of jobs like that in that 22 milligrams per day category. And again, females primarily because of the loss of blood and the added training on top of that.
Great. Okay, so we have another question. Do you recommend, or do you have recommendations for the timing of iron intake before, during, or after exercise?
No. So I think, and we get that question a lot too. That's a really good question. So now when we talk about iron absorption, it can get a little bit complicated with inflammation and things like that. So there's other studies that have looked at, so if we have so the firefighter question was a great question, actually. So if we have like an acute or chronic stress, that tends to decrease absorption of iron. So if that's something that's chronic, happening over and over and over again, that tends to decrease our iron absorption. So one might think, so if we have our training session that's really, really stressful and somebody's a vegetarian, you might not want to consume your heavy iron meal right after that training session. But overall, if you make sure that your plate for the day is complete with iron, I wouldn't see why it would be a problem when we're looking at the big picture. But that's a great question, and people are looking at that.
Great. Okay. And are there signs of iron deficiency that are easily recognizable other than somebody going to get a blood test? Or the things that people should be aware of that might be the first hint that something is happening there?
So it's a little more recognizable in, I would say, athletes who train on a more regular basis. So a lot of times they'll actually see a decline in performance. So people who run regularly and who keep track of their times and mileage will say, wow, my 5K is getting much harder to complete in my 20 minutes or whatever it's taking them. You know, a lot of times you'll read a lay publication and they'll say the first sign of iron deficiency is fatigue. Well, fatigue could happen for a number of reasons. I wouldn't say the minute you feel fatigue, you go out and take an iron supplement. I think that's really bad advice because like I said, anemia can be not only from iron deficiency, but B12, folate. So it's not a great idea to just go on fatigue. So we really have to confirm iron deficiency with not only hemoglobin, but a ferritin test. So that's why at the first sign of a decline in performance, if you're an athlete, I would definitely follow up, you know, tell your coach what's going on if you're an athlete, and then he or she should refer you to the team physician, and they should do a quick check of your hemoglobin and ferritin, which are very, very cheap tests. If you're a recreational athlete, I would definitely see my doctor to see what's going on, you know, because you could have a GI bleed, something else could be going on. So it's really worthwhile to check out these types of things and not just go to the drugstore or GNC and pick up some type of supplement that you may or may not need.
Thank you. Hi, this is Gretchen Patch at the national office. I have two questions. I always have two questions at least. My first question is connected to, you had mentioned serial blood donors a couple of times, and I was curious what the definition of a serial blood donor is.
So I can't remember what the maximum amount of blood, because I know a lot of college students donate blood the maximum amount they can. So whenever the Red Cross comes to campus, I think they allow you to do it once or twice a month or something like that. So every time you donate that pint of blood or so, you're losing X amount of milligrams of iron. So if you do that on a regular basis, that would be a huge iron loss, especially if you're a woman who's menstruating. And I'm not telling people to stop donating blood. We need people to donate blood, but that's iron that needs to be replaced. So serial blood donor would be somebody who donates blood on a regular basis.
Okay. And then my second question is, so you kind of cautioned against supplementing, without knowing kind of if you actually need it or not. I'm curious if you have thoughts on multivitamins that include iron, even in smaller amounts. I'm not sure that I see it like at 100%, of your recommended daily allowance, but I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a supplement person, but I think a lot of people do take, for instance, a one a day, and I'm not advertising any brand, but the one that comes to my mind is the Centrum one a day, the non-mega version, and that has 100% of the RDA for women for iron. So it has 18 milligrams of iron per day. I think that's fine. Once you get into the megas and the separate iron supplement, a lot of the times that's 365 milligrams of ferrous sulfate, which is a whopping dose of iron. That's when we start to get into trouble if we don't need any extra iron. But I think the one-a-days are fine if we're trying to fill out the rest of our diet. I think that's fine.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we have a question a specific question about your research. It says, did any results from your recent study show an increased performance in iron uptake in the placebo group? Is there any psychological impact on performance in the study regarding the placebo group?
In the most recent study with the symbiotic supplement, I actually didn't measure performance. So this was only a pilot study to see if the symbiotic versus a placebo would improve uptake from that low dose iron supplement. So we don't have any data on any measured laboratory performance, physical or cognitive. So we were just looking to see if this would work because it's never been done in humans before, only animals.
Great. Can you describe some of the cognitive deficits that you see, the cognitive performance deficits that you see with iron deficiency?
Sure. So now it's different in little kids, a little bit different in little kids because they have such rapid brain development. But for instance, in college age kids and people like us who are working, the primary outcomes that we look at are attention, focus, memory, reaction time. So we use little computer tests to measure these, but if you think about what those are in terms of your daily work, we have those types of functional outcomes all the time. So reaction time to basically, if you're asked, like you're asking me a question now, my reaction time to that question. If you're asked a question in a meeting, okay, your memory, your recall, how you can recall names, can you recall numbers in a list? Okay, so we do certain tests like that. Attention to detail, focus, a go, no go test is one of the tests. So can you identify what I'm asking you to identify while ignoring everything else? So those are the types of functional outcomes we look at for cognitive tests.
Great. Okay. Another question that came in from someone watching remotely. Should endurance-based or all active female athletes be supplementing or monitoring their iron intake?
So that's a really great question. So I'm an advocate of so you know how all NCAA female athletes, they need a physical before performing their sport. I'm an advocate of all of those athletes having an iron test. So basically hemoglobin and ferritin be part of that physical to say, what is everybody's iron status coming in to catch this problem before it becomes a major problem, okay? As for recreational female athletes, I think, if you have had a problem in the past, you probably should know and monitor your iron status. If you haven't had a problem in the past with iron, then you probably don't need to monitor your iron status. But if you feel like you're having symptoms of iron deficiency, if whatever you're doing, be it if you feel like your reaction time or your attention, your focus isn't best, and this is something that you feel you need attention to, go and ask your doctor to take a look at your hemoglobin and ferritin. Again, these are cheap tests. But I feel that people, at least competing athletes, should have at least their hemoglobin and ferritin tested at the beginning of a training season to see where they are, to know if it should be monitored and followed up during the season.
Okay, thanks. So another question that came in says, I've noticed some iron is advertised as easily digestible, excuse me, and some others are very expensive while others are cheap. Is there a form of iron that you recommend? Are the expensive irons really better?
Yeah, there's a lot of different iron supplements, and there's iron supplements that are organic and vegan and vegetarian. So more expensive is not better. The most popular is actually the cheapest. So that's ferrous sulfate. So that is very easily absorbable, and it is the cheapest. So again, it's ferrous sulfate. It's abbreviated FeSO4. It's what we use in our studies, and it's the low dose that's in the Centrum 1 a day. So if something is vegetarian, that's ferrous sulfate. That just means it's not a heme iron supplement. The heme iron supplements, that actually means it has some kind of blood or animal tissue in it. Those are a little bit more bioavailable. But again, if you are somebody who's kosher, if you're Muslim, if you have any other religious type restrictions around your food intake, you wouldn't be taking those types of supplements. But ferrous sulfate is a great option for everybody. And it comes, obviously, all supplements come in different doses. But the cheapest option seems to be the best option, and it's the most studied option as well.
Hi, this is Gretchen at the national office again. So I was just thinking about the heme and non-heme versions of iron, and other than you know, our body's uptake of it, do we process it differently? Do we use it differently, or is it just how we absorb it that makes the difference?
It's actually just absorbed differently. So heme iron is absorbed through one channel. It's actually more of a straight shot. And non-heme iron has to go through a little bit of a different channel, and that's why it's a touch more vulnerable to inhibitors and enhancers. But once it's been absorbed, it's used in the exact same mechanism and stored the same way. That's a really great question.
So when a female athlete, for example, has maybe it's a seasonal or, you know, within the sport has a more sort of acute or sudden increase in training load, I assume that sometimes there's probably maybe a more transient change in iron status that will kind of return to normal when training load decreases. How do you manage that as far as sort of monitoring, but also being aware that there can be transient changes that don't indicate long-term sort of chronic problems?
So what Lynette just described is actually not a change in iron status due to iron, but due to blood volume, due to increased training. So when we basically get used to a new training load, we increase our blood volume, which can make us look anemic, right? Because our hemoglobin would go down. But once we adjust to that new training load, our blood volume normalizes. So unless you're like looking at your hemoglobin on a weekly basis, you wouldn't even see that number, right? So that's one thing to consider. So when you're adjusting to a new training volume, sure, you're going to be tired, but once you acclimatize to that new load, you're going to feel better. That's what training's all about, is gradually increasing the load to train at a higher load. So that's not due to iron itself. Now, if you can't adjust to that load, then you have to say, why can't I adjust to this load? Then you're looking at nutritional or other types of issues. But that's a really good question. So that's what we call dilutional anemia. So that's a blood volume issue. And in pregnancy, we see the same thing. We see this huge increase in blood volume. People's hemoglobin plummets until the woman adjusts to that blood volume.
Great, thanks. Another question that came in, what are some foods that can help, what are some foods that can inhibit iron absorption?
Okay, so a lot of foods can inhibit iron absorption, but I hate giving food lists because I don't want people to stop eating these foods because they're really good for us, you know. But again, the more colorful foods. So for instance, black beans. Black beans are a great source of iron. You know, when you look on the can, it's 7 milligrams of iron per serving. But black beans, they're actually a deep blue color. When you look at them really closely, that black blue color, it's called an anthocyanin. It's a polyphenol. So that polyphenol is an inhibitor of the iron absorption, and not completely. It's not like it cancels it out, you know, and students, when you talk about these things, they're like, well, I might as well not eat black beans anymore. It's a waste of eating it. That's not true. We need the polyphenols for other types of things, and it doesn't cancel it out completely. But those polyphenols kind of bind up some of the iron, okay? Other tannins in coffee and tea. So the brown color that gives coffee and tea its color, all right? That's another binder of iron. Other things like fiber. So Raisin Bran is a great source of iron on the label, but fiber has a lot of phytates in it, and it also binds up iron and other minerals as well. So other minerals, the people who are mineral people and chemistry people, a lot of things with the +2. So iron is a +2. So other +2 minerals get bound up by these things as well, especially by fiber. Spinach. So it drives me absolutely nutty when I see a picture of spinach in a Lay magazine article about iron, because Popeye is associated with being strong. So they took that and said iron, spinach, Popeye, strong, blah, blah, blah. Iron is a really great source of, or spinach is a great source of iron on the label, but it's filled with oxalates. Again, oxalates are great for other things, but that binds up a lot of the iron. So when push comes to shove, it's not such a bioavailable source, especially fresh. Now, when you cook that, the oxalates become less bioavailable and more iron becomes available. So again, there's a lot of these things. We could go on for days to talk about what's a good and bad source of iron in terms of what inhibits and what enhances iron, but it doesn't mean to stop eating these foods. That's why if we eat a balanced diet, if we eat a wide variety of foods, I mean, if you only eat spinach, then it becomes a problem. But if we eat a wide variety of foods, then we get into less of these types of issues.
Great. I think we have time. We're going to do one more question. This one also came in from a remote viewer. It says, can iron supplements be used as a performance enhancer in apparently healthy individuals? Can an individual ingest iron in a way that will increase performance in an athletic event as one would with ingesting branched chain amino acids and carb loading?
Absolutely not. Iron, it can't be used as an ergogenic aid, because only if you need iron will you benefit from it. So I have normal iron status. If I'm like, well, you know, my friend who was iron deficient, her performance improved because she took iron. Well, that's because she was iron deficient and she needed it. If I take iron, my performance isn't going to improve because I don't need it. I won't use it. My body won't take it up. So it can't be used as an ergogenic aid that way. So I think this is the message that needs to be put out by you, all of you. So take this information and use it, that it can't be used in that manner. So it's not an across the board thing. If you need iron, if your body needs iron because it's deficient, it will take it up and use it. And from the studies that we and others have done, it can increase your performance. But if your body can't take it in, absorb it, and use it, you're not going to benefit from it. So that's a great question, and it's a great tie-in, because our body doesn't want to hold on to extra iron. Guy, girl, little kid, big kid, it doesn't matter who you are. You don't want metals hanging out in your body if it can't be used. But that's a really good question. We get those questions all the time.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. This has been really informative. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks everyone who joined us remotely. We hope you'll continue to join us for our Brown Bag series. So here in the national office, we're gonna thank Diane with a round of applause, and with that, we will end our webinar.
Thank you.